Welcome, everyone. In just over 2 years, Climate Governance Malaysia has organized for over 90 events and developed a reputation for well-curated content. We are pleased to have contributed towards significantly advancing the conversation on climate governance in this country. CGM was even referred to in the 12th Malaysia Plan, which was recently announced, which we were gratified to see. And we hope that soon we can extend these conversations to the ASEAN region as well. As for today, in this first week of COP-26, we are pleased to announce our first collaboration with the US State Department. Professor Dr. James Salzman is the Donald Brent Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law with joint appointments at the UCLA School of Law and at the Brent School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. He's also the fifth most cited environmental law professor in the field with over 100,000 downloads of his articles. Welcome, Dr. Salzman. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it's late in the evening for you and that you participated in 7 webinars over the last 2 days. So thank you for your time. I would now like to pass the floor over to Dr. Salzman. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get this Zoom window lined up. I hope that works for you.
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And it's a real honor to be able to speak with you, I guess, this morning. It's evening here, as you mentioned, on an issue which really, in many respects, could not be more important. And so the presentation I'm going to give today is based really on 2 separate issues that I'm going to tie together for the audience. One of them is the value of ecosystem services. Actually, really 3. One is the importance of nature-based solutions and how COP26 really brings all of these together. So I want to start at the beginning with a notion called ecosystem services. Some of your viewers may be familiar with this, others may not. This is a concept that really came to be widely adopted in the early 2000s. As Gretchen Daly has defined it, ecosystem services consist of the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. In very simple terms, one way to think about this is that nature is the principle and ecosystem services are the interest that we gain from the principle. You run down the natural capital, you get fewer ecosystem services. So to get more specific, what types of ecosystem services am I talking about? So you can broadly categorize these into 3 different baskets. The first is what you might call translocation. This is moving something from one place to another. Pollination. You cannot have pollination without insects and birds and bats moving pollen from one plant to another. Seed dispersal as well. Stabilizing. We may think of pest control as pesticides. In fact, that's a tiny, tiny part of global pest control. The vast majority of pest control, in fact, statistically, almost all pest control is done by insects eating other insects, by birds eating insects, by natural predators eating insects. Climate regulation through carbon sequestration, mitigating droughts, flood control through mangroves and through other wetlands. And finally, the last category of ecosystem services is what you might call cycling and filtration processes. This is what purifies our water so it's safe to drink. It's what breaks down the waste in the environment. It's what renews soil fertility. Now, the idea that we gain important benefits from our natural systems, that is not a new idea. Plato was talking about this in ancient Greece. You can read the description to yourself. He was talking about the ecosystem service of water metering, basically how soils take in water and then slowly release the water over time. So this is not a new idea. What's interesting about this, I think, is that if you think about the benefits that ecosystem services provide to us, how could we survive without these basic critical services? The answer is we could not. And because of that, you might assume that the laws would explicitly protect ecosystem services and markets would prize ecosystem services. It turns out that actually is not the case. It's not the case at all in the United States, in Malaysia, in Korea, in any country. That simply is not the case. Why is that? There are three basic reasons. The first is ignorance. We take these things for granted. Who thinks about climate stability? Who thinks about why our water is purified in watersheds? We simply accept it. It's a benefit that we all enjoy. If you think about the production of goods, for example, food that's grown on farms, it's actually quite remarkable how sophisticated farmers are about how to manage their land to optimize the production of rice or other crops. Why is that? Well, the answer is because there's a market for it. They are rewarded for making more productive use of their lands than otherwise. The problem with ecosystem services, this is what economists call public goods. So a public good is something that is enjoyed by all, but cannot be owned. So if I take an apple and I bite a chunk out of it, that's my apple, right? That is a private good. But take something like carbon sequestration, it's basically sucking in of carbon, it's climate stability of the environment. We all benefit from that. I can't make that my particular benefit. And the problem is that when carbon sequestration is reduced, when climate stability is reduced, there's no market price to show us that. So to take a simpler example, if there's a wetland or a mangrove that is protecting a community from flooding, there's no market signal to indicate the loss that we are all suffering when that buffer is destroyed. And as a result, there's no signal to us to say we need to protect that mangrove system, that wetland system. Scarcity triggers action too late. And finally, we have poor protection of ecosystem services in every country around the world because our policies and our institutions are not directed to manage these services. You know, if you look at the boundaries of a state or a county or a province, those are not based on ecological boundaries. Those are based on political boundaries, and it's difficult to move beyond that. So let's talk now about how this might work in practice, thinking of us, for example, as the government, as a regulator. So assume that there is a watershed where there is heavy rain, snow, rain in the upper watershed. It goes down the watershed. The problem is that there are farmers. Some farmers are very responsible over here. They basically have riparian fencing that uses the ecosystem services of nutrient retention to purify the water. Over here, we have farmers who basically let their cattle graze in the water, hang out in the water. And that is degrading the water quality downstream. And so the question becomes, what can we do as a government to address that? We could pass rules that regulate requiring riparian fencing. We could penalize or fine or tax if you're not fencing. Property rights I won't focus on right now. We could try to educate them, or we could pay them. And that basically is the idea behind the notion of payments for ecosystem services, which, as I'm going to show in a few minutes, is central to one of the key messages and debates in COP-26. How do we basically make use of natural systems, nature-based solutions to try to address climate change? In very simple terms, here's the problem. And I want to focus on these two slides are actually the most important slides of my entire presentation. So I want to spend some time on these. Let's imagine that you are a farmer or a landowner, and you need to pay your bills. How do you manage your land? Well, the only way to get money is to sell crops, commodity crops. You may be providing water purification. You may be sequestering carbon, providing climate stabilization. You may be providing habitat for biodiversity, but there's no payment, there's no benefit to doing those. So what do? You manage your land to maximize crop production at the loss of these other public goods. The goal behind the management of ecosystem services, the payments for ecosystem services, is to change this model. And to change the model so that the landowner has equal incentives to purify water, to create habitat for biodiversity, and to sequester carbon. So that is the great challenge in environmental law of the 21st century. How do we change the incentives for landowners to promote the public good instead of simply promoting commodities, agricultural goods, which to be sure are important, but the public has needs as well. So what I want to do next is I want to describe to you some examples from around the world of how we've found ways to pay for ecosystem services to change the incentive structure. And after that, I'm going to turn to the discussions taking place in Glasgow at COP-26. I think the single most famous, the single most important story about how to pay for ecosystem services is New York City and the Catskills watershed. Now, New York City is known for a lot of things. It's Broadway plays, it's great cultural life, it's great skyscrapers. What it's also known for people who live there, is the quality of the drinking water. If you take a glass of water and you compare it in a blind taste test with bottled water, you're going to find that the New York City tap water wins time and time again. The tap water is the best in the country. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is because the water is not coming from New York City. It's coming from the Catskill and Delaware watersheds 125 miles away. It's put in pipes, goes to a reservoir. There are mechanical filters to keep out leaves and sticks. There's some chlorination, and that's it. And then it goes out the taps. That's why it tastes so good. There was a problem, though. In the late 1980s, the quality of drinking water in New York City started to decline. And the reason is because there was heavy development in the upper watershed that I showed you before. And so New York City faced a dilemma. They could either build a treatment plant to treat the water at a high expense. They estimated $6 billion in capital costs and up to $300 million per year to operate the plant. Or, and this is where it gets interesting, they could invest in nature. And so what New York City decided to do was, instead of building a treatment plant, instead of investing in gray and built infrastructure, instead they invested in green or natural infrastructure. And so they floated a $600 million green bond, which they used to pay the upper watershed owners to change the way they managed their land to ensure water quality was provided to New York City downstream. So what do we learn from this story? New York City faced a very simple financial choice. They could invest in built capital through a treatment plant or natural capital through the environment. And for purely financial reasons, it made more sense to invest in ecosystem services. But it's not just a New York City story. So we can go to Costa Rica. Costa Rica has the longest running national payment for ecosystem services. This is where basically they get money from the Global Environment Facility, and they basically send the funds to landowners, primarily for water purposes, to protect the upper watershed landowners. Hydropower operators, it turns out, are the ones who are willing to pay the most for this because they want to prevent erosion that might decrease the ability of them to store reservoirs. Brazil. In Brazil, they basically pay farmers to provide for soil conservation, for forest cover. In Santa Catarina, they provide money for exactly the example that I provided you beforehand. It turns out, interestingly, that China is actually the global leader in terms of payments for ecosystem services. China suffered terrible floods in the 1990s, and they decided that one of the reasons for these floods had been deforestation, been cutting down trees on slopes. So they said, we're going to pay landowners, small landowners, to plant trees to prevent erosion. This is the largest single program, not just in the developing world, in the world. China spent $43 billion US from 2000 to 2010 to provide incentives for landowners to put in trees. So my research over the years has been focused on the institutional legal structures of payments for ecosystem services. And I was very curious back in 2014, 2015. I knew the Catskill story, I knew the China story, but I had no idea really how prevalent payments for ecosystem services were. And so I teamed up with some other researchers, and we did the first global comprehensive survey of payments for ecosystem service programs around the world. And what we found is that there were over 550 programs around the world, and they were spending $36 to $42 billion per year on these programs. And here's what's interesting. So I was asked in this presentation to focus in particular on water and watershed services. It turns out that the vast majority of the payment for ecosystem services programs focus on watershed. So for example, if the government is subsidizing particular activities, in 2015, that was almost $24 billion US dollars. There were 139 programs in 39 countries, $564 million in others. If you look at the total amount that's being spent, most of it is payments for watershed services. So why is that? The challenge when you're designing payments for ecosystem services is the problem of too many beneficiaries or too many suppliers. If everyone benefits from the provision of ecosystem services, who's going to pay? Right? You have to have a discrete group of beneficiaries. Similarly, if everyone is providing these services, whom do you pay? It's the same kind of problem. The reason that payments for watershed services have been so powerful in the setting is that you have water utilities, and they act as a single unit on behalf of the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of ratepayers. So if you get water out of your faucet, you're being charged. And the water utility can add a tiny little tax, a tiny little fee that they collect. They can then go to the upper watershed owners and say, we're going to compensate you for maintaining the forested cover, for actually increasing the forest cover. So that's the point I want to make for payments for watershed services. What I want to turn to now is how this idea of payments for ecosystem services can change the way we think about land management more generally. And I'm going to use the biodiversity as the example for this. So we know as a general principle that if you have a pristine landscape, there's high biodiversity. If you have a totally developed commercial monoculture, there's low biodiversity. Here's the challenge. The challenge is what happens in between, because the fact is that most of humanity is human-dominated landscape. There are very few truly untouched landscapes left in the world. So is it the case that once you start to develop the land, you rapidly drop biodiversity? Or are there ways to manage a land so that biodiversity is enhanced? And the same point can be made about water quality. Is there a way to manage a landscape so that water quality drops precipitously? Or can you manage a landscape so that water quality is maintained for a long period of time, and at the very end, water quality drops off? So here's what's happening in the United States in terms of land use planning. So traditionally, if you were trying to protect a watershed for water quality, if you were trying to protect an area for biodiversity, you would put a fence around the big area and say, keep out, this is a park. That's changing. And what's happening now is that the land use planners are saying, what are the most important areas for water provision? What are the most important areas for biodiversity? What are the most important areas for economic activity? And it's a much more sophisticated land use planning. There are certain areas that matter, and certain areas actually that aren't that important. It's to get much more granular planning if you focus on ecosystem services. Why does this matter in terms of the larger societal questions? Well, if you're proposing a dam or a logging project, how is it going to affect carbon sequestration, provision of water, controlling erosion, biodiversity? You can't know that unless you have a good sense of how the ecosystem services are actually being provided. And this is an example of something called the Natural Capital Project, which is Stanford, University of Minnesota, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Asian Development Bank has now taken this on as a way to promote land use planning in the Asian region. So the first half of the talk has focused very much on how to think about ecosystem services, because this is really, in my view, one of the most exciting and important economic tools and environmental tools to protect the natural capital that we all have. So what I want to turn to now is talk about how all of this fits into COP26, happening in Glasgow right now. And the term that I want to introduce that I'm going to talk about is the idea of what's called nature-based solutions. So let's start now with first principles. So the greenhouse effect. This is the basis, this is the driver of climate change. And I'm not sure everyone is as much of a climate nerd as I am. And so let me explain briefly why this matters. When the sun and the energy from the sun reaches the earth heats up and it produces what physicists call black body radiation. This goes back into the atmosphere. If the atmosphere has certain molecules, so-called greenhouse gases, those greenhouse gases absorb the energy coming out and they retransmit them back toward the earth. That is the greenhouse effect. It's called a greenhouse because of the effect you get when you have a glass greenhouse. It basically re-radiates the energy back to the earth. The problem, in very simple terms, is that we have been increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases to the degree that we are sending more energy back to Earth than used to be the case. We are supercharging the climate system. We are warming the surface of the Earth. And as a result, we are having dramatic changes in weather events, in sea level rise, in melting of the ice caps, and of climatic belts moving as a result of all of this. Now, this has been known as a fundamental challenge since the 1980s, really not late 1980s. And so we're now going to pivot to COP26 in Glasgow. And what I want to do is give you a very brief timeline to explain how we got to where we are. And as this as the goal of this presentation provides, to talk about where we're going as a result. So 1992 is when the story begins. And at that point, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is adopted in Rio de Janeiro, the so-called Earth Summit. And the 1992 UN Framework Convention basically says that we, the nations of the world, agree that climate change may be an issue of concern. And we're going to monitor what's going on. And when we think that there is dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, then we will take sufficient actions. Before then, though, we're really not going to do very much. We're going to monitor what's going on. There's an aim of returning to 1990 levels by 2000, but it's not a hard goal. That starts to change as climate change becomes a bigger issue internationally into the 1990s. By 1997, things have changed, and you get the Kyoto Protocol. This is the first conference of the parties from the UN Framework Convention. At this point, what the nations of the world agree to follow is what's known as a targets and timetables approach. This is a top-down strategy where the developed countries of the world, not developing countries, but developed countries of the world, they agree to specific reduction targets. US, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 5% by 2008 to 2012 compared to 1990. European Union, we will reduce our emissions by 7%. And this is the model that goes into effect. And there's a great deal of enthusiasm, but the enthusiasm dampens very quickly. One of the main reasons is that in 2001, the Clinton administration goes out of office and the Bush administration, George W. Bush, comes into office and they withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. And so China was never had obligations because it's a developing country. The United States says we're not going to be part of this. And so the two largest carbon greenhouse gas emitting countries, they're out, which is important. That's almost 50% of total greenhouse gas emissions at that time. And so as a result, negotiations start again. Now, I've worked as an international negotiator, and I can tell you it is not exciting work. This is actually a very accurate photo that actually was taken. If you're at the Cook Islands, you are not in the middle of things at these climate negotiations. But there's a great deal of diplomacy. And the goal is going into Copenhagen in 2009, we're going to basically start afresh. Copenhagen is essentially a disaster. The United States, they had proposed legislation, did not pass Congress, so they could not, the Obama administration could not offer anything. China says we are not going to sacrifice economic development for protecting the climate. And so the two largest emitters have nothing to offer. And so as a result, Copenhagen ends with really nothing more than this sort of simplistic phrase that they take note of an accord. It really is nothing. And so there's a great deal of concern after Copenhagen, is anything going to happen on climate? Fast forward to 2015 and the Paris Agreement. And this really is the moment of truth for the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the largest international conference ever held. France is brilliant in its diplomacy. It works with the United States, it works with China, and both countries announced 6 months before the Paris negotiations that they are going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They have stated targets. So we get to Paris, and what Paris does is it sets a warming target. They say the goal is 2 degrees, but we'd like to aspire to 1.5 degrees, which becomes important at Glasgow. And they developed this new phrase called INDCs or NDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. What they're saying, don't worry about all the text on the slide. What they're saying essentially is that they are rejecting the Kyoto Protocol approach. As you may recall, Kyoto was top down. Paris is bottom up. And so instead of countries being told this is your reduction target, instead the Paris Agreement says to the countries, every single country, US, Malaysia, China, Saudi Arabia, you decide for yourself what goals you want to accept, let us know, and in 5 years, starting in 2018, 5 years thereafter, we will take a collective stock taking. We're going to basically decide, how are we doing? Another aspect of this that becomes important that I'll talk about in a moment for Glasgow is they have this very vague phrase called the acronym is known as ITMOs, Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes. This basically is shorthand for market mechanisms that I'll talk about in a bit. No one knows what this will be, but this is the hope. So now what I want to do in the last part of the talk is to tie together the payments for ecosystem services in the first section, the negotiation regime for climate in the second section, and bring them together and talk about what does this mean for nature-based solutions at Glasgow. And I want to phrase this as a very simple question. How do we as policymakers, as global citizens, make trees worth more standing than cut down? And why do we care about making trees worth more standing than cut down? The simple answer is that trees are carbon pumps and carbon sinks. So any vegetation, including a tree, when it is growing, it sucks in carbon dioxide, which is good for climate change. It takes carbon dioxide out of the system. It exhales oxygen. That's great. What happens when you burn a forest? You cut it down and let it degrade. Well, first of all, you lose the sink capacity. That forest can no longer suck in the carbon dioxide, and the forest becomes a source. So we can actually see this in real time with a measure of what are called carbon fluxes. So this is a measure of whether a forest is taking in carbon dioxide or releasing carbon dioxide. So if you look at the Amazon River Basin, that is slightly taking carbon dioxide in. The trends are because of deforestation, it's going to be a net emitter of carbon dioxide in another 10 years, unless we can slow deforestation. Congo River Basin in Africa, that's doing great. That is sucking in much more carbon dioxide than it is emitting. Southeast Asia, where Malaysia is, that's bad news. In Southeast Asia, the forests are actually, because of deforestation and agriculture and clearing for agriculture, these forests are releasing more carbon dioxide than they are taking in. That's a problem for the world, not just for the region. And the question is, what can we do about it? Because the problem is we are on course right now to be well above 2 degrees of warming. And that's not good. That's going to increase serious storm events. It's going to increase sea level rise. And for countries like Malaysia that have a lot of areas that are just above sea level, that's very dangerous. And so we want to avoid that happening. And so let me turn now to what can we expect at COP-26, which is, I presume, the main reason that we're all here together. And I want to basically focus on 4 different topic areas with my primary interest on the carbon markets, on nature-based solutions. And so the first sort of issue to think about is climate ambition. Now, as you recall, at the Paris Agreement, countries submitted their NDCs, and they have revised them for the Glasgow conference. And so this is taken from the Climate Action Tracker. It's a nonprofit think tank that looks at these things, and it has analyzed all of the nationally developed contribution submissions to the Climate Secretariat. And what they found is that all the ones that were submitted, 21 are actually stronger than they were at Paris and after Paris. 9 of them did not increase their ambition. 89 they didn't look at, but the ones they're focusing on are really the major emitters. And so this is concerning. This is actually a more important graph. This basically says, if we take the NDCs as submitted at their face value, which I think is dangerous to do. Many of these NDCs, I think, are actually submitted, not many, some of them I think are submitted in bad faith. The countries have no real intention of satisfying these goals. But if you basically take them at face value, what this suggests is that we're going to be at 2.7 to 3.1 degrees by 2100. That is not a place that we want to be. If you're optimistic, it's at the 2 degrees, but the goal is 1.5 degrees. And this gap is known as the ambitions gap or the emissions gap. Somehow we need to get from here, where we are today, not to here, but to here. And the question is, how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is to increase the ambition, the aggressiveness, the aggression of the NDCs. So, for example, the Biden administration has announced that by 2030, its goal is to reduce greenhouse emissions by 50 to 52%. That's a major reduction. Will it happen? That remains to be seen by what happens in Congress. If the US Congress passes the proposal the Biden administration has put before them with over $500 billion in clean energy incentives, I think it may well happen. If that bill doesn't go through, I think it's a more difficult road. So what do we know? We know that 130 countries have made what are called net zero commitments. China says they're going to peak their emissions in 10 years, and they're going to reach net zero by 2060. I already described the US pledge. Here's the problem. The problem is that talk is cheap. There is no single country right now that is on target to meet their 2030 policies. Now we'll see, 10 years is a long time and things may change, but there is a major concern right now about what actually is going to happen in the next 10 years. So what can we expect to happen in Glasgow? I'm quite cautious about this. The Biden administration has not been able to date to pass its bill in Congress to get the funding for this. That remains very much in question. Xi Jinping, the premier of China, has said that he will not attend. And they are right now ramping up actually coal extraction because of the fuel shortages that they're experiencing in China. So that's moving in the exact wrong direction. And Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has said that he is not going to attend either. So for myself, I'm not expecting major major changes or major announcements to happen in Glasgow. So, but that's not the only issue that's in play here. There are other issues also. So one of them, I think, is, and this is particularly important for countries like Malaysia, developing countries that are trying to find resources to deal with this issue. So there was a pledge at Copenhagen and following Copenhagen to provide, by the developed countries, to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 through 2024 to help poorer nations address global warming. As of 2019, the number was, according to the OECD, $79.6 billion. Put another way, that's a shortfall of about 20%. $20 billion is a lot of money. And so one of the challenges is going forward, will this finance gap be closed? The United States, the Biden administration has said they're going to double their climate contributions. The European Union has said it's going to increase its climate contributions. That still leaves a shortfall. And so the question, will countries like Japan, other wealthy countries, step up? It's also important to realize that most of these finances, most of this money is in the form of loans, not grants. So 71% of the money that's provided is loans with the expectation that it will be paid back. Most of those monies are being dedicated to energy and transport, not to nature-based solutions. And so if you're a forested country like Malaysia, that's a concern, right? You want more money to be focused on forestry, on helping you to battle deforestation. That's not where the flow of funds is going right now. A similar issue that's worth considering is, and this is the last part of the of negotiations that I think are going to be very important, is what's called Article 6. So let me take a step back and explain what Article 6 is. So you may recall that under the Kyoto Protocol, they basically had a placeholder called the Clean Development Mechanism. And the question was, how do we involve developing countries who do not have emissions reduction obligations with Annex 1 countries, those developed countries that do? And they said, we're going to create something called the Clean Development Mechanism. No one knew what it was at Kyoto. They basically developed it afterwards. And the idea was, we're going to allow, primarily the thought was forestry projects that basically increase forest cover. We're going to give countries credit for increasing forest cover, and we're going to basically allow them to sell these credits to countries, Annex 1 countries, that want to reduce their overall emissions, so they can buy so-called offsets from these developing countries. That was the idea. It worked to a degree. The Paris Agreement said, we want to keep this idea. And so they had this placeholder, what I talked before about the internationally transferable mitigation obligations, ITMOs, to keep it simple. These have not been developed. And this, in my mind, is one of the most important outcomes of Paris that are tied to payments for ecosystem services. So to think about this for a moment, take Malaysia, right? You've got a lot of forest. You are facing the challenge of deforestation. If you can reverse deforestation and even increase your forest cover, you're doing the global community a good service. You're basically taking carbon dioxide out of the air that wasn't sequestered before. You're helping us battle climate change. The question is, can you be paid for that? And that is an open question. And so the Article 6 negotiations that are taking place right now are addressing this very issue. And during the Q&A that follows the discussion, I'm happy to go into more detail about how this works. But it seems to me that the big question for Malaysia is twofold. The first is, can you get formal recognition for the benefit of your forestry management if you're able to meaningfully address deforestation? And the second, which I think is actually even more interesting, is this whole question of offsets more generally. So if you look at large companies really around the world, multinationals, what you'll find is that many of them in just the last 2 or 3 years have said, we are a net zero company. What does that mean for a law firm or for an accounting firm or for a management consulting firm? How can a law firm possibly be net zero? Well, the answer is they buy offsets. And offsets essentially are projects that pull carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, like forestry management, like things you can do in Malaysia. And these are all private. This is the key point. So let's say that you are IBM or you're Apple or you're Microsoft or you're British Petroleum, and you say, we are a net zero company. How are we going to show we're net zero? We've got to purchase offsets from forested areas that have either reduced deforestation or actually added trees. And that's where I think for a country like Malaysia, that's where the action is going to be. This is a classic payment for an ecosystem services. This circles back to what we were talking about originally. And it ties in water as well. Because if you have forested watersheds, you're going to have healthier water purification. You're going to have better flood control. This is an example of what is sometimes called an umbrella ecosystem service. If you can keep forested areas, there are a lot of benefits, not just for carbon sequestration, but for water management and potentially for biodiversity. And for a country like Malaysia, for sure, for biodiversity. And so let me just end up here. It's been 40 minutes, which is what my time was. So what do I take from the COP and from COP-26? First point, a conference of the parties is not an endpoint. It's a way station along the way, along the process. And so the goal of a large-scale COP like COP26 in Glasgow is to push the rock up the hill. And so what would I consider success for COP26? It's the power of momentum. It's getting tailwinds to basically tell individual countries the international community cares about climate change, and we endorse and we affirm actions at the national level to address things in your own way, whether it is carbon sequestration or reducing emissions. The international world is focused on Glasgow right now. We are having a conversation in Malaysia about negotiations in Scotland. If that's not international intention, I don't know what is. And the idea is politicians know that the world is looking at them. Now, do I expect major negotiation breakthroughs in Glasgow? No, I don't. And the reason is that these positions were negotiated months ago in national capitals. However, COPs like Glasgow, like COP26, they can reinforce the international momentum toward addressing climate change. They can energize national governments to do something serious about this, and they can provide a short-term roadmap for what we're going to do into the near future. And so with that, I'm happy to answer questions and to talk with other folks, but those really are the key points that I want to share with you in my time together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salzman. That was really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for spending your time and walking us through these really critical topics. So the first question we've got some questions in the chat box, but I just wanted to kick this off by saying offsets require this element of additionality. And we've recently seen the pledge to end deforestation by 2030. So how do we manage perverse incentives? And what are the ways to manage the tension between the needs of a community and the responsibility of a government to manage scarce resources in the first place, especially when assumptions no longer hold? For example, situations where rainwater harvesting becomes illegal. Could you guide us through that?
There's a lot in that question. So let me, thank you. So let me unpack that, because I think there are 4 questions in that question. So the first question is additionality. And so for those of your listeners who are not familiar with that term, additionality refers to the problem of paying someone not to do something that they were not planning to do anyway. And this really has been a major challenge with payments for ecosystem services. So in the Costa Rican Payment for Ecosystem Services program that I talked about earlier, landowners were paid not to log particular areas. Well, it turned out that the areas that they were enrolling to get paid for, they were on steep slopes. They were never going to log those areas. And so they were being paid for nothing, right? There's no benefit that arose from that. So tie that into your point about this pledge for no deforestation by 2030. I'll believe it when I see it. As I'm sure you know, there have been past pledges to end deforestation. This is not, we've been here before. And so excuse me for being cautious about this pledge. I believe in show me. And so I don't focus a great deal on these pledges to end deforestation. We've seen these before. I think the bigger issue, because the other thing is the national government can pledge to end deforestation, but are they going to enforce that on the ground? Right. One of the problems, as I know that you understand, is illegal deforestation. Organized crime is largely involved with deforestation. So you can have proclamations and rules and regulations and statutes, but if you don't have enforcement on the ground, then you get deforestation. And so I think the declaration is great. But what I also want to look for is, are there going to be enforcement units on the ground that go to the illegal miners and go to the illegal loggers and say, that's it, you're out? That's hard to see, right? And it's important, and it's difficult because, as you said, there are local communities that are involved here as well. And I think that's where the human aspect becomes very difficult. So these are resource-based communities. It's as much an issue in the United States as it is in Malaysia. So how do you say to a logging community, your time has passed? You know, this is the 21st century. You're no longer a logging community. That lands hard, and it's very hard. And so I think one of the great challenges, and the term for this is called the just transition. How do you transition for a coal community that they no longer mine coal? How do you transition from a logging community or a mining community? You can't do that anymore. We know from time and time again that when the government comes down with an edict and says, you were doing X, now it's Y, it doesn't work. All right. We need to be much more sophisticated, much more, I think, humane in terms of how we think about these issues. So I think the deforestation commitment is great, but I don't really think much of it. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding. And it's very difficult because we tend to think about, and I teach international environmental law. I'm at Harvard, teaching at Harvard at the moment. And we think of international environmental law as that what really matters is happening in Glasgow. That's wrong. What really matters is happening locally. Glasgow basically is sending a signal to the international community, but what really matters is domestic, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And if the Malaysian government can take the signal from Glasgow that we have to get much more serious about enforcing logging rules in these particular areas, then I'll be impressed. But I think that's what we need to look for.
I fully
and
agree.
I don't mean to focus on Malaysia. This is a global problem.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question now from someone from Shell, and she is asking, because Malaysia is proposing corresponding adjustments in the country's NDC when carbon credits are exported out of the country. So how does this work with voluntary and compliance markets, mandatory markets?
Yeah, so this is what's known as the problem of double counting.
Yeah.
Which is what's being negotiated right now in Glasgow, and it's part of Article 6. And so Brazil actually first posed this problem, and they posed it, I think, in a pretty crude way. They basically said, look, if we are reducing deforestation, we're reducing our emissions, so we get credit for that, and we should be able to sell those reduced emissions to another country so they can claim it as well. That's called double counting. You don't need to be a genius from accounting to realize that's a problem, right? So either Brazil can claim it or they can sell it and another country can claim it, but you can't have it both ways, right? And that's basically what they're negotiating. And there are very few countries that actually think that's a good idea. And so I think that's going to go by the wayside. I think another aspect of that question is formal accounting mechanisms. And this is where I think things are going to get very interesting. So in the Kyoto Protocol, there was a top-down trading system, every country, every Annex 1 country had its reduction target. And if you got credit from Clean Development Mechanism, a joint implementation, it went into this common sort of obligation, right? You could trade, that was not a problem. Paris Agreement completely repudiated the Kyoto Protocol approach. The top-down approach is gone. The single market is gone. Instead, we're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom. So the challenge now is, does the United States accept Malaysian offsets? Does the European Union accept Malaysian offsets? There is no international market anymore. And one of the great challenges of negotiations in Glasgow right now is, can they create some kind of international standards so that what Malaysia is doing, they say, look, what we're doing satisfies this international standard. Every country should be a potential market for us. And that's important because the more demand you get, the more supply you'll get as well. We're not there. And I think one of the things I'm looking for the results from Glasgow is to see, are they able to create some kind of international standard so that Malaysian offsets that meet the standard can sell to any country.
Yeah. So following on from that, if we somehow don't end up with consensus for voluntary carbon markets, Article 6, then how can corporates engage in offsets that would support legitimate NBS projects in Southeast Asia? What would you suggest?
Right. So this is going to happen regardless of what happens in Glasgow. So as I mentioned, the number of companies that have declared net zero is literally, it's just remarkable. I'm a lawyer. Law firms are saying they're net zero. I never saw that coming. And so I mentioned this in the talk. So where are they going to go for offsets? They're going to go to the voluntary carbon market. And the problem is, are they going to go to, Jim Salzman's offsets? Here they are. I offer you a ton for $1. It's great. Or are they going to go to high quality? And so there's a law in economics that's called Gresham's law. And Gresham's law basically says that bad currencies drive out good currencies. So what they're referring to is a time when a metal coin, actually had a certain amount of silver or a certain amount of gold or a certain amount of copper. And if you had a coin that had less than that, that would drive out the other more valuable coins if they were treated the same. And so the question is, are Jim's offsets going to drive out the high quality offsets? And I think the answer to a large degree is going to turn on civil society. So the person who submitted this question is from British Petroleum. British Petroleum is a high profile company that cares a great deal about its brand. And so British Petroleum, I would guess, is not going to take a chance purchasing low quality offsets, because civil society will say, what are you doing buying Jim Salzman's offsets? Those are terrible, right? This is an embarrassment. You should be ashamed of yourself. And so I'm quite certain, and this is happening in large major corporations that have a brand that they're concerned about, and they're saying, look, we need to protect ourselves. And the way you protect yourself is by buying so-called high quality offsets. And so what's happening is that there is a market competition taking place among certification organizations saying, we're the best. No, we're the best. And I think the question that is yet to be determined is the market going to rise to the top, or is it going to go to the bottom? And I think that's one of the great questions that we don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, and some markets are even layering on their own certification on top of a Vera certification, for example.
That's right.
So just complicating the process. So another question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Salzman, while you're on the line. Malaysia, 97% of our water is from rivers and streams. And I wanted to talk about immunity of public officials. So here we get our water from rivers and streams. The provision of treated water is corporatized and regulated. How do you see the evolving accountability of public officials who fail to anticipate the likely consequences of environmental destruction, especially water, not just scarcity, chemicals from agriculture, water sources being contested, and conceptually, how far could the immunity of public officials be carried?
Yeah, so I at the outset, I want to be very careful. I'm not an expert on Malaysian law or the
Absolutely.
Malaysian water system. And so let me talk about this from an American perspective. And the American analogy is Flint, Michigan, which some of your listeners may have heard about. So this was a case in the United States where public officials did a very poor job in notifying residents that there was lead in drinking water. And a number of lawsuits have been brought. People have been fired, but no one really has been brought to account. And that's a problem. And the problem is that when the public services do not view in practice their obligation to protect the public, then the public is harmed. And so in Flint, Michigan, for example, many citizens were drinking, particularly young people were drinking water that had high amounts of lead that we know will lead to neurological harms. Now, there is not sovereign immunity in the United States for the local officials. They can be sued. For the federal government, there is immunity. They have to agree to be sued. But I think it's a huge issue, and it basically proves the point that if there is not a consequence for acting badly, don't be surprised if people act badly. Now, I will say that one of the ways this has been addressed in the United States, and I suspect this would be true in Malaysia as well, is the power of the press and the power of public opinion. And people were so outraged by what happened in Flint that there were consequences, and they've changed the laws dramatically as a result. And so sometimes, depending on whether the case can actually be elevated and highlighted, and there's enough public outrage, you can get changes that way. You don't need to worry about particular immunity of individuals.
Thank you. That's a very relevant example. I've got a question from the floor about funding and grants, which at times, and we all recognize this, it doesn't reach the end user. For example, farmers in less developed countries. But there are technologies that exist that will enable higher yields and increase the efficiency of the chemicals that are being used or runoff, for example. So would the funding of such technologies encourage increasing and better implementation of land, so leading to increased land yield? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the whole idea behind payments for ecosystem services. And the fundamental question is, what are the incentives for the individual farmers?
Mm.
So if you're a farmer and the only way you make money is to produce cash crops, don't be surprised if you don't provide biodiversity habitat, if you don't focus on water quality, if you don't focus on carbon sequestration. Any rational actor is going to say, forget that. I don't make any money doing that. And I think this question is a variant of that issue. If you can create incentives, well, first of all, do you need incentives, right? So it may be that farmers using enhanced technology can make enough profit that you don't need government intervention. That's the first question. If that's not possible and there are public goods benefits, right, the public benefits as a result of these changed activities, then I think it's legitimate to say, should we direct public funds to change their incentives, to change their behavior? But this gets back to the additionality question you asked earlier, right? There are good reasons for farmers to be efficient. And so if they're going to do this anyway, why would you spend public funds for something they should be doing anyway?
Yeah. So, and this comes back to the point I made earlier about perverse incentives. And I just want to share with you a really wild idea. So if someone came to you and said, I have a license to log timber, and so then there's that element of additionality, right? If I'm going to sell this to you, then these forests, these trees are not going to be logged. Is that an example of a solution that we want to see?
Yeah, so this is an example that comes up a lot. And I find it a very frightening example because everyone could threaten to cut down trees, right? So, I mean, to use an example I sometimes use when I teach, should we pay people not to mug us, not to attack us, right? Because if you don't pay me, maybe I will pull a gun, right? Or pull a knife or whatever. But everyone can pull a knife or pull a gun. And so I think that, inherent in the notion of payments for ecosystem services is this issue of what are you paying for? And in order to think about that, you have to think about what is sometimes called the counterfactual. So if there were no funds going toward this, what would the world look like? I don't think we would be robbing each other, right? I like to think that we would not be robbing each other. So if that's the counterfactual, why am I paying you, or why are you paying me not to mug you, right? But this is difficult for governments to do, right?
Yeah.
Governments are very good at setting very clear rules. You're in, you're out. Premising payments on a future hypothesized world, there are very few programs that do that. They're very hard to administer.
Dr. Salzman, it's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for staying up late and for spending time with us in an already packed beginning of the week. I look forward to hosting you again, and have a good night's sleep. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. One of the great disappointments, I've never been to Malaysia.
You're most welcome.
I know I'm dying to go there. So perhaps sometimes we can meet in person, but thank you very much.
Absolutely.
For the opportunity.
Thank you so
to
much, Dr. Salzman. We will be in touch.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now, everyone, it gives me great pleasure to welcome the moderator for the next session, Chuang, who is no stranger to those of us who have heard his rapid fire and often uncomfortable interviews on BFM Breakfast Guild. Chuang is a journalist and entrepreneur with experience in internal audit, tax consulting, and financial media. He counts over a quarter a century's experience working in and covering corporate financial capital markets in Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and London. Thank you so much for moderating this session. Over to you, Chuang.
Thank you, Datin Sri. Well, thank you everybody for staying on for what is essentially our next session this morning. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Meena Raman. Now, Meena is based in Geneva, Switzerland. She's the legal advisor and senior researcher at the Third World Network, an independent non-profit international research and advocacy NGO involved in issues relating to development in developing countries, and of course, in particular, human rights. She's also the president of Sahabat Alam Malaysia and the legal advisor to the Consumer Association of Penang. Meena practiced public interest law for over 25 years, representing grassroots communities, taking on big corporations in Malaysia. But for the fact that she's in Glasgow for COP-26, which is obviously the subject of today's session, Meena would have been here in the flesh. Now, so instead, I'd like to now play a recording of Meena providing a very blunt summary of the environmental conundrums facing us today, and ending, of course, with a short Q&A where she and I had an interesting to and fro on how to address some of these challenges. So let's play the video.
Hello, good morning to all of you. My name is Meena Raman, and I come from the Third World Network. We've been involved very much in the climate negotiations ever since 2007. That's me personally, right up to the COP in Madrid. Now, what to expect at COP26? I just like to pause a little bit and to say that the most important thing we need to recognize is that when the world came together in 1992 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was already recognized then that global warming was a problem. And that wasn't just global warming alone, wasn't just climate change, it was also the environmental crisis and the development crisis. But what was clearly recognized was the fundamental principle of common but differentiated responsibility, particularly underlined by the developing countries, and is still relevant today, where the historical responsibility of the Western world, which industrialized since the Industrial Revolution with absolutely no fetter on carbon emissions, grew rich and wealthy. And this was also after colonialism, the colonialism and the period after that. So we have to recognize that the developed and the developing world are not on the same footing. So the Rio, the Earth Summit, many of us were the children of Rio, born during that period. And it was recognized that the problem is common, but the responsibility is differentiated between developed and developing countries. And this is the underpinning of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into effect in 1994. Now, of course, the long road to Paris, it took a long time before 2015, where the world managed to come up with the Paris Agreement. Now, there again, it was a very, very difficult moment to get a deal in Paris. There was a lot of effort on the part of the developed world, particularly, to spin this as if the differentiation between developed and developing countries no longer exists. They actually wanted to blur the lines between developed and developing world. It was perceived by many of us that it was supposed to make it look like the Paris Agreement was a replacement to the Kyoto Protocol, which is about mitigation alone. For the developing world, this could not be, because for them, what was also key, adaptation, very, very key for largely the vulnerable countries who are already facing the impacts of climate change. Furthermore, it was also very key for the developing world that any ambition on mitigation and also adaptation to meet the adaptation needs, what's actually key is finance and technology transfer and capacity building. So this is called the means of implementation. So these, the ambition on mitigation and the need to address adaptation, and also going beyond adaptation, the concept of loss and damage, because it's already being recognized that in many parts of the world, when you have a tropical cyclone hit, you wipe out the entire economy. It's not about adapting anymore. It's really about rebuilding completely from a start. So the notion of loss and damage, which was very important and was a separate pillar of the Paris Agreement. You had mitigation, you had adaptation, you had loss and damage, and the means of implementation, finance, where the obligation of developed countries to provide the finance to developing countries to do all this. So the understanding in Paris was basically that if this is 2015, we are talking. We have all come together. The United States is part of the Paris Agreement because they were out of the Kyoto Protocol. China and India and the developing world are also in the Paris Agreement. The obligations are common but differentiated. And all the articles of the convention of the Paris Agreement make it very clear what the responsibilities are. So when we go to Glasgow, it's not like you're inventing a new deal altogether. And that's what scares the daylights out of me. Because what seems to be happening is that, again, many of us view this as the shifting of the goalposts. Let me explain that. What's very clear is that insofar as the emission reductions are concerned, we all know that all the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions put together, will not take us to a limiting temperature rise by 1.5, 2 degrees was what was agreed in Paris, but with the pursuit to 1.5. And now there is this big notion, thing in Glasgow that we have to limit 1.5. We as civil society agree that a 1.5 degree world, limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is a guardrail. That's important. But how do you get there? And that is where the difficulty comes. For all these years since the convention and the Kyoto Protocol, and then you have the pre-2020, which is known as the period before the Paris Agreement contributions, you actually see that the developed world has increased their emissions. And this is unbelievable. By all the reports that have come up, what we actually see is that the developed world has not the aggregate Annex 1 emissions. Annex 1 means the developed world in the convention track, they're called the Annex 1. The emissions actually increased. And the increase in aggregate emissions is it's about what they on aggregate they achieved only 13% emission reductions between 1990 and 2018. I mean, this is mind blowing, because in the Kyoto 2, the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, they were supposed to revisit their ambition. The US was not a party to this, but on the whole, the idea was that at least 25 to 45% emission reductions compared to 1990 levels. Not that, we are only at 13% in 2018. So today, when the developed world talks about ambition on mitigation, the developing world is the one that is really concerned, because of all the promises made so far, the emission reductions in terms of real emission reductions now has not happened on the part of those who have to take the lead, which is what the convention and the Paris Agreement are about, developed countries taking the lead. Now that leadership is far from there. Now the second aspect, which is the means of implementation, the finance part. And in Copenhagen, if you recall, in 2009, the Obama administration, President Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, they were all together and came out this number, this figure of mobilizing, the developed world mobilizing 100 billion per year by 2020. For Glasgow, this is a very key issue. Has that 100 billion per year by 2020 been delivered? It depends on which report you read. If you read the OECD report says that at least about 80 billion has been mobilized. Whereas if you look at other reports coming from Oxfam and others who've analyzed the figures, and what they are saying is at the best case scenario is about 28 to 29 billion dollars that has been delivered. So whatever it is, it's far away from what developing countries actually need. And so this mobilizing 100 billion per year by 2020, now that's another failure to deliver. Emission reductions, leadership, failure to deliver. So you're going into Glasgow, where the world is supposed to gather again. And the most important aspect of Glasgow delivering is how do the developing world honor the promises that they have promised. Now, we all agree that everybody has to do their contribution. No one should be saying that we don't have any obligation either to reduce emissions or to address adaptation or to adjust to meet the loss and damage. But for the developing world, particularly those who are poor, and coming during the time of the pandemic, and this is where I think the world is different. Currently, you can see that according to UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, what they have said is actually that many developing countries can no longer achieve their ambitions set out in Agenda 2030. This is the SDGs and the Paris Agreement due to the pandemic. Rising indebtedness, difficulties in economic recovery, poverty, more people going into poverty, including in this country. So delivering on all those ambitions will actually require international cooperation between the North and the South. This is what UNCTAD says, on a coordinated and unprecedented scale across all the deeply interconnected economic, social, and environmental challenges, with estimates of the required additional investments amounting to a minimum of 2% of global GDP annually. This is something like 1.7 trillion per year for the next few decades. This is what UNCTAD is telling us. So it's not that this is not achievable. I mean, this number is actually far from what the developing country needs are. Even if you look at the NDCs of developing countries, they actually have estimated that what they would need would be $5.7 to $5.8 trillion by 2030 to achieve their existing NDCs. So if Glasgow is supposed to be a success, what we have to say is that it must deliver on the finance ambition. And this talk about the net zero. Now, for us, this is a very serious concern. Now, this net zero by 2020, in the Paris Agreement, it doesn't say that. What it says is that at a global aspirational level, that the parties must ensure that there is a balance between the emissions by sources and removals by sinks by mid-century. And it's a global aspiration. They don't talk of it as a prescription for every country to do net zero. Now, because this is not possible, and this is my one or two large final points I will make, which is very key to understand, that if you look at the latest IPCC report, the physical science that was just released about a month ago, what they say is that the global carbon budget that is left, for a 50% probability of limiting temperature rise to 1.5, what is remaining after you have deducted all the historical emissions and the cumulative emissions, what's left is only 500 gigatons of carbon space of budget. Yeah. Now, if you cross that, if you exhaust that, the 1.5 degree will be no longer achievable. And this is what the IPCC says. So if this is the case, and we are, the world as a whole is emitting 42 gigatons every year. So you have about a decade or so before the remaining carbon budget is exhausted. So whose interest are we pursuing when we talk about the US having a net zero target of 2050, the UK 2050, and of course China says 2060, but China is still a developing country. It's different from the developed world. But if you look at the historical emissions of the developed world, many of us are saying that they should not be having net zero by 2050. They should, in fact, have rapid emission reductions now. In fact, some people say that they ought to have gone negative emissions by now because there is no longer room for them to continue to emit. And it's very disappointing that when you look at the production gap report, this is another report that will come in terms of fossil fuels and where the pathways are, the trends are, you would note that in many of the developed countries, they are not phasing out oil and gas. The G7 talked about coal because they are phasing out from coal, but coal is really a problem of India and China and others, but not oil and gas. And even UK, the COP-26 presidency, we understand that there's a huge fight about reducing their emissions from oil, because there is actually plans to continue to explore and extract oil. So in a world that we say is climate emergency, we need to do what everybody has to do in a way that is actually going to protect the planet and the poor. This net zero by 2050 through the use of carbon offsetting, carbon markets which will offset again. That means the developed world will pay the developing countries to offset their carbon. There is no time and no room for that. There has to be deep decarbonization, and there has to be reforestation and rehabilitation and a stop to deforestation. So we'd have to do the removal the emissions reductions, deep decarbonization. We have to do the increasing the sinks, but we can't do that with carbon offsets, and we cannot do that with distant net zero targets. So we are very worried that there would be this big narrative out there. Oh, if every country goes to net zero by 2050, we would have saved the world. We would not have saved the world. It would have been an illusion. And for us, that is the biggest worry that we have. So finance is key for developing countries. Technology transfer is key for developing countries. And we need to rapidly have decarbonization, particularly in the developed world, rapid emissions. Now, developing countries cannot follow or copy the same model of development. They have to go on the low carbon pathway. No excuse for anyone, but it's only in this kind of international cooperation of an unprecedented kind. What we don't want to see, and which we are witnessing, is actually trade wars, international fights, competition in the international arena, and this is not the way forward. So, challenge is huge in Glasgow. Any further questions?
Hi, Meena. Okay, well, I think your monologue really summarized your thoughts of many people in the room. And I think perhaps not wanting to be too facetious, but maybe for COP27 to get the whole process a bit accelerated, we should have the next meeting, COP27, either in Amsterdam or New York City to accelerate the process, on pain of which they will be underwater by then. But to truly move the needle, I think really to ensure any semblance of success at COP26, I think you're right in pointing out that the biggest polluters, i.e. the richest countries, need to step up, right? But the problem is post-pandemic affordability. The UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, has told Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, that there's no more new money to fight the climate effort, which means the host itself may not have enough money to meet its own very, very ambitious climate targets. How would you address this whole issue of post-pandemic affordability?
I think that is, well, to put it a bit undiplomatically, it's bunkum. Yeah, I'm sorry to use undiplomatic language in this audience, but the reason why I say that is actually, if you look at, it's not about not having money. If the G7 is actually do what they say in terms of removal of the fossil fuel subsidies that they give to their corporations and so on, we understand that the G7 governments actually provide something in the order of $87.7 billion a year in support for fossil fuels. Now, if they don't do that and they are going to do away with these subsidies, that money is available. And we also understand that in the response to the COVID pandemic, there was actually a McKinsey report which said that the Western European countries alone have allocated close to $4 trillion, an amount almost 30 times larger than the Global Marshall Plan during the World War. So what we say is that where there is a will, there is actually a way. And even the IMF announced a 650 billion special drawing rights just about a month ago. This is a kind of instrument which is non-conditional, it's non-debt creating. But the problem with the special drawing rights is it's allocated according to how much of money is put by the country. So the wealthier countries will get more allocation of the special drawing rights, which actually led to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to say that there has to be a substantial reallocation of the unused SDRs, not a symbolic one, but a substantial reallocation to the vulnerable countries that need them, including the middle income countries. So for me, it's not about not enough money. It's really about having the political will. And if we could do that in the Marshall Plan and that phase of the period where the whole world came together. And another thing about the COVID pandemic, I mean, it's really, really very sad that the vaccine inequity, which still persists today, also shows you the lack of international cooperation. There is enough vaccines, but not enough vaccines for everyone. So this famous quote by Gandhi, which is there's enough resources for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. And this issue of no money, we don't buy that. In fact, some world leader had once said, if the climate was a bank, it would have been bailed out by now.
Well, Meena, there's very little to refute what you've just said. Just in terms of the Marshall Plan, right, which is a concerted global effort, global in the sense that those affected by the Second World War came together to try and repair the world. The thing is, in the current scenario that we're in, which is an increasingly isolationist world, where the referendum talked about leaving the European Union, about how America is pursuing its own agenda first, China is also withdrawing and becoming a very domestic country business-wise. We don't have that globalized. In fact, globalization seems to have lost a lot of its momentum. Without a globalized, without a pro-globalized approach, how can there be a global approach to a global problem in the form of the climate?
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, that's precisely the question all of us are asking. And that's why I started by the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. The deal was already done. If we only honored the deal, and if we don't shift goalposts, and we actually do what we need to do, then we can save the world and the poor particularly. But you're right. I mean, this requires real leadership, a phenomenal, far-sighted, less confrontational, geopolitical construct. Yeah. So it's huge. But for us in civil society, as we and the social movements around the world, the leaders are not going to listen to I mean, what I want to say is that unless and until you have a major swell of ground movement from below, from voters who actually are very concerned by the climate crisis and who would actually push the agenda. That's why the youth movement is very key in the northern world. Greta Thunberg has inspired a lot of activists. Some people don't like her, but I think that she's put it on the center stage. Enough of blah blah. No action. We have to do the action. Enough of talk. And she's right. So I do think that we need that global swell. So if the private sector, civil society, all of us join forces and put pressure on our governments, because our leaders have to speak to the citizen, the ordinary citizen. And I think that's critical.
Well, the thing is, Kyoto and Paris were, they were, I guess they flattered to deceive in many ways. And Glasgow also seems to be shaping up at risk of doing so. The thing is, the difficulty is in the biggest polluters and the biggest needle movers, the Americans and British and the French and what have you. But in the developing world, the difficult countries are like the Chinas and the Indias of this world, rich but not rich enough, and still growing in many parts. And India is the same. India's Minister for Power, Rajakumar, has discussed and talked about how COP-26 targets are a pie in the sky. And Xi Jinping of China may not even be present as it stands right now, as we speak, Meena. And if the biggest polluter in the world in the form of China is not present, and with its leader endorsing COP26, then what hope? As you say, we've got 10 years, give or take, left. We don't have that much time anymore. So the biggest guys are not in the room and agreeing to move forward. What hope is there?
I think the problem for China is that the whole world is just blaming China. This is shaping out to be a blame game. I think if it was inspiration, if it was not contestation, it was not confrontation, it was not combating, and it's not like, the developed world is saying that they are the heroes now. Oh, UK 20 net zero by 2050, US net zero by 2050. This is all illusory. It won't save the world. So this is the point. The whole narrative and the spin has been to spotlight on the Indias and the Chinas, where the per capita emissions are far lower and they are not the historical emitters. So I think this is where those of us from the South, the global South, we're very worried that the voice of the global South is being muzzled. I mean, not muzzled, but in a way, the participation even to get there, many delegates are not going to be able to be present. Civil society from the global South is not going to be there in strong crowds. All the restrictions are going to keep people out. So all this, and then the world media and the world attention, will they hear the voices of the global South? So I think that what we need to really understand is that this is not about shaming and naming, but if it was really about cooperation, I'm sure Xi Jinping would have been there at the table.
So to ensure success or any semblance of success at COP26, Meena, what would it take? If you say the onus of responsibility lies on the rich Western nations, who were the original polluters of the world, what can amount to success? Would it be some kind of financial commitment to the $100 billion a year and concrete commitments, and beyond that, what else?
Well, the most important, and then that's the first, meeting the promise that was made in 2009 in Copenhagen, the delivery of the 100 billion per year. So that's critical. So it's not about, committing again. It's about delivering on that commitment. So if there is a clear roadmap that will show this country is doing this amount, this amount, this amount, this amount, and the 100 billion, as we can see, is really a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that's needed. So that's key. The next is actually to define a very robust process. And this is what Glasgow must deliver for the next new goal on finance, because it was agreed in Paris that by 2025, there will be a new finance goal, which will be determined by the needs of the developing countries, not plucked out from a hat by any leader, but really based on the needs. And there's a needs determination report that's out with all the numbers. So these are very two clear deliverables. You see, what's key for us is every COP that I've been to, the developing world is always united around this issue of finance. And that will really kickstart. I mean, it's not that they're waiting for finance before they do anything. In terms of adaptation response, in terms of response to loss and damage, the developing world is already using their current budgets. You have a flood strike a country, like, heavy rainfalls, frequent intensity that we are seeing at this point in time, monies come out of national budgets themselves. They're not waiting for international budgets. Yeah. But if we want to upscale that, and in terms of enhancing the ambition, make sure that the NDCs are all ramped up on the mitigation side, money, money, and money. And nothing more than the private sector knows this. Business knows this. Technology, we need the technology needs that are also important. So the developing world is saying, do your part of the bargain and we will do our part of the bargain. And that for me will be a very big victory on the COP side. If they can deliver that. If the British can deliver on finance, we would really boost everybody's morale that we are on the pathway that to reaching that whatever Paris goals.
Okay, well, money may not be able to buy love, but it can certainly save the world, Meena. Good luck in Glasgow. I hope you stay warm and stay safe because you're going to be in the middle of winter when you get there. So good luck and safe travels to Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, and once again, a great thank you to Meena for her, very pointed comments and opinions. And now on to our next speaker, Chandran Nair. Now, Chandran Nair is the founder and chief executive of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT for short. That's an independent pan-Asian think tank with offices in Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong. And they are focused on a deeper understanding of global issues, including the shift of economic and political influence from the West to Asia. And of course, the dynamic relationship between business and society and the reshaping of the rules of global capitalism. Chandran also sits in the executive committee of the Club of Rome, a distinguished global grouping of scientists, economists, business leaders, and former politicians who identify solutions to complex global issues, including to address planetary emergencies like climate change today. I should also mention that Chandran is a regular speaker at the World Economic Forum, APEC summits, OECD events, various UN conferences, and is also a member of the WEF's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability. Chandran, a very warm welcome. Thanks for talking to us. Now, let's begin with COP26, where already there seems to be hiccups in terms of, two of the world's biggest emitters in Russia and China not being present, and key national commitments to limiting warming not yet being met. Chandran, I'd like to ask you, and to kick off this discussion, how do you rate COP26, in fact, the COPs, as an ongoing solution to addressing climate change?
Morning, Chuang, and good morning to everyone. I don't know where to start. I listened to the first two speakers, and it was I was going to say entertaining, but it was interesting. So maybe before I start to address your question, how I rate COPs, maybe I'll just say I don't do COPs, so I kind of don't rate it. But before I do that, maybe I could just say a couple of things from what I heard to put things in context as well. The last two speakers spoke a lot about certain things about valuing nature, etc. And then the second speaker, Ms. Raman, also spoke about how net zeros and things like that are essentially fictitious and mythology creating. But we all fall to narratives. Even you, Chuang, who knows everything, fell victim to a narrative that has been spread. China is the world's biggest polluter. Well, that's a false narrative, right? China is the world's most populous country. Therefore, if Chinese have a right to essentially energy, a bit of development, they will create more emissions. That's a fundamental understanding. And so narratives are very important, and we create these false narratives. We created a narrative that are about nature-based solutions. This too allows us to essentially seek refuge in nice things. And then the last speaker also spoke about, money, money, money. It's not really about money or nor technology. Can I put that bold statement out? It's really not about that. And I mean, certain countries are clearly in need of some assistance, but there's discussion that the solution is something about money, and the sort of rich North code for, Western white civilizations will save the other South, which is code for brown and black people, is such an old world kind of East India Company narrative. We need to change this narrative. So that's kind of what I want to say. So to your question about what do I think about COP? Well, if you've been watching the last 2 days, it seems to be, stage managed by all white guys. I mean, who in their right mind believes that Biden's got anything to say that he can actually do? I mean, supposedly he turns up as the most powerful man on the planet. He can't even get his own citizens to wear a mask. And who in their right minds actually thinks Boris Johnson is a serious person? So we need to really understand how these things play out. So yes, so yesterday there were 2 announcements, and your first speaker said, the whole deforestation by 2030. Well, that was actually a promise made in 2014, I think. And then there was the big methane thing, which Biden said, again, taking the stage to say America is going to lead. Well, if it's going to be methane by 20 to 30% reductions by a certain stage, he's going to have to fight a huge political battle with the fracking industry. And at the same time, as America is Biden's talking all this stuff about America is going to lead, what does Biden do the last few weeks? Tell the Saudi Arabians to pump more cheap oil so that they can essentially continue to live the American dream. So I think this is my point about, this conversation you and I have, to kind of move away from we need more money and we need more technology. There are sort of simple things called nature-based solutions, and we don't have to worry about essentially the fundamental issue, which is what rights and freedoms do we have as in a crowded planet in the economies we live in, and therefore what can we consume, which is the pricing issue, which then plays into, of course, nature pricing ecosystem services, right? But you can't take these things in isolation. Fundamentally, you're going to have to understand, do you and I in a busy city like if you in KL have a right to a car? How many cars do we have a right to? What is the price of electricity and things like that? So those are the fundamental questions we need to ask. But you'll see, even with due respect to the professor from Harvard, the Harvard business model is not interested in asking the question about how do we price consumption, because its entire liberal economic narrative is about human beings should be able to consume whatever they are. In the American system, in the Western narrative, curbing consumption is essentially an infringement on civil liberties. But actually, we will not be able to consume. And that's actually the apex of the issue. And then we can talk about things like how do we price carbon and all this sort of mumbo jumbo about CDMs and offsetting and stuff like that. So what I think a COP-26 means, same showboating, but I hope in this discussion, and you will lead me to it, we can talk about then what do we do in Malaysia? I'm interested in what we do in Asia at the country level, because, talking about finance, is Malaysia a poor country? No. Do we need money from the UK? Of course not. So we're still thinking like subservient, members of the Commonwealth, subservient to the East India Company kind of mentality. Malaysia is not a poor country. Are we stupid people? No. But what we do have is a broken political corrupt system that we need to fix before we can do anything about COP. So don't think about COP. Think about our country, and that applies to other countries as well. And that's why the Chinese model for me is a way to look at it. That's why Xi Jinping doesn't turn up. He's going to get all these Western guys bashing him. He's got better things to do at stay at home and fix stuff at home, which he can do because the political system is slightly different. So that's kind of where I wanted to set the scene, and hopefully you can moderate me so that I behave myself in terms of what I say.
Absolutely, Chandran. I mean, I think the Malaysia solution will still be top of the agenda. But before we get to that discussion, I think we have to further set the stage in terms of informing the argument that you have made many times in the past, that the Western solution is a very narrow solution because it focuses on the economics of the issue. You have said in the past that there's many types of capital which have been ignored by and large down the years. The most important of which is the pricing of natural capital. It's been a free ride, as you talk about. Air, water, soil, and so on and so forth, which has been extracted willy-nilly for free for many, many years. You've also talked in the past about human capital, which has been by and large ignored. And there's also, as a corollary of that, social capital, which then informs the whole discussion about politics and corruption and racism. So before we get to the Malaysia solution, and I see you smile there, Chandran, talk about how you've debunked the Thomas Piketty model of inequality, this discussion of inequality, where it's too narrow on economics and dismissive of the other types of capital.
Well, I mean, he wrote two very good books, and I don't want to, but my response to that, I think it was about 8-9 years ago, and I shared that link that was published in Yale, I think. My response to that was, and this is so typical, I think the dominant Western neoliberal economic model is one that people believe in religiously, right? Believe in religiously. The main advocates, the main speakers about things about economics, the new environmental challenge, etc., are Westerners. So this is an ideological struggle. So, even a conference like this, we start off with a Western guy to speak, just saying, okay? So we always, who's never been to Malaysia, but, just saying, right? So we are engrossed in this. Many of the Western economists, etc., just know one worldview, and it's understandable. They don't know the rest of the world. They don't understand. So even in the Club of Rome, which I'm a member of, the majority of members, very smart people, Americans, Europeans, etc. But the majority are essentially Westerners. They have such a strange worldview. They talk about esoteric economics, etc. So my debunking of that was Piketty's analysis using, analysis purely from the data from the West, and framing it around Western neoliberal economic frameworks. But countries like China operate very differently. So when we talk about, how we're going to finance things, I think the first professor also mentioned China has done a huge amount of reforestation projects, etc., by not borrowing money. They didn't look for the World Bank to send them money, and they didn't do trade-offs, etc., and offsets to get the money. They did it by essentially printing their own money. There are ways that which you can do this, and they mobilized it. And essentially, the value created through the reforestation was essentially put on the balance sheet as essentially through the value of the new forests created and the social impact. So you can, rather than have gold bars to back your currency, you can have forests and clean rivers as a way to also, in terms of local denominations, essentially legitimize your spending in terms of printing money. So that was my main thing. But your point about the other social capital, which I talked about, the other capital I talked about, the social capital, is institutions, right? I talk about institutions. Coming back to Malaysia, our institutions are broken because, again, this is so related to everything we're talking about, even if we want to talk about the forests, right? Because we have a rent-seeking economy. We have a rent-seeking economy where elites, and particularly our dear Malay elites in Malaysia, think the country is theirs. And therefore, they can do anything they want with it. And the others should just operate within the Alibaba system. Your uncle will do the contract, and my brother-in-law will do the legal papers, if you see what I mean, the Malaysian context, right? So that's really the problem. We have a rent-seeking economy. So nothing is essentially protected. There's no legal frameworks. I think Datin asked a question to the American professor about accountability in terms of water rights, etc. I mean, that's such an important question, but it completely doesn't apply in Malaysia because everyone's off limits. I mean, the former prime minister got even convicted in court, and today he's walking around. There's no rule of law. So why does this apply? Why does this matter in terms of climate change and all the things we're talking about? Because we're going to need laws, and we're going to need draconian laws that are enforced. I'm not even talking yet about where we need to go. What does a one-car policy look like in the Klang Valley if we are to essentially get to what we need to do? It will not reduce quality of life. It will require a fundamental shift, but that's what we need to do. So you need institutions. And every day, you and I know as Malaysians, you will see reports about illegal incursions into forest land, dumping into rivers, etc. Everyone breaks the law, no rule of law. So the social capital is fundamental in a crowded planet if you want to protect natural capital and then essentially human capital. But if you don't have that, everything's broken.
Well, Chandran, given what appears to be an immovable edifice in the form of the political economy and the corporate structure in Malaysia, which tends to somehow align itself with the political economy as well, what wiggle room does Malaysia have? Maybe does it come from the private sector where individual corporations, which have a certain heft and size, make individual decisions about what to do, but about trying to move the needle on their own steam instead, rather than relying on policy from a government which doesn't necessarily have the environment at its core.
Well, just two points I'd like to make, right? At a global level and a policy level, sustainability, climate change are public and common goods. Companies don't do public and private goods. That doesn't make them bad people, but you can't ask Pizza Hut to sell less pizzas, right? That's as simple as that. A Pizza Hut wants you to buy more pizzas, and they don't care if you get obese, fat, and ugly. They don't care, right? So the palm oil industry doesn't worry about sustainability. Doesn't make them bad, but the palm oil industry's objective is to fill every goods in the supermarkets with a drop of palm oil, right? So that they can continue to expand. Other people working in the industry, bad people? No, that's not what I mean. But that is the capitalist economy exported around the world. So Pizza Hut doesn't sell less pizzas. Pizza Hut's role is to get you to eat as many pizzas as you can. Only the state can then say, hey, Pizza Hut, we got a problem with your cheese, because your cheese is creating an explosion of certain diseases, etc. Are we going to regulate, right? So that is very important to understand. Companies don't do sustainability, and I outlined that in my second book. But company can, and usually under duress and regulation. In Malaysia, there's few and far between who follow every law and principle. I did a talk about 10 years ago to a bunch of CEOs from listed companies in KL, private, and I asked them, so how many of you can put up your hands and say that you essentially meet every environmental regulation, you pay your taxes, and you actually follow every labor law, etc.? Nobody put down their hands, because we all know that is the modus operandi, right? So that's one thing you need to understand. So as soon as the social values in the society get corrupted, then this idea of climate change, etc., becomes challenging them, becomes fictitious. But then to your point about, can companies do certain things? Of course they can. They can do certain things, but they have to take leadership role. And that is a huge call, right? Leadership role. They have to challenge various things. In Malaysia, have you seen a single corporate leader take a position on the things challenging our country? So in fact, 3 weeks ago, I wrote a piece saying corporate Malaysia. In my view, if you want to change things in Malaysia, and it is an oblique route to talk about the things we're talking, first, you need to essentially challenge the race-based racist system, because that's where the rent-seeking starts, right? Now, has any corporate Malaysia spoken up about racism in Malaysia? No. So they are complicit. So if you can't even address the fundamentals of governance structure and the institutional issues, how are you going to change climate change? How are you going to address climate change? How are you going to save the forests in Balloon? How are you going to talk about even making sure that something like the Klang River water supply system works? Because then you have to say, hey, how come with so many incompetent people in so many important positions? You got to make people accountable. You got to fire them irrespective of race. And that's the fundamental point about institutional issues to address these existential threats of our time. And therefore, if you expand it on a global level, then I say, when we look at COP, I think there's like 190 countries or something. I didn't even know there were 190 countries. I thought it was 160 something. But there's, everyone goes there because, it's a nice festival. You can all go there. But the serious people like, Putin and Xi said, okay, let's see what happens. We got to solve problems. But the point I'm trying to say is 60% of all emissions are between 3 economic regions, right? 2 countries in an economic region. So the United States is the EU and China. Per capita, China is the lowest. So we don't need to bring 190 people and create all this circus, right? But it's a good circus for the British and the French to have, because it shows they're saving the world. And then you start talking about stuff like, let's save the rainforests of the world. And if you saw what the professor showed in terms of the 3 forest regions, nothing in Canada, nothing in the USA. It's all, Congo, there's Brazil, and there is Southeast Asia. All those countries badly managed, and my God, they need to step up. That doesn't mean I'm saying we shouldn't step up, but these international agreements are kind of Western politicians, hogging the stage and deflecting issues. And then we fall into the trap in thinking they're going to help us. They're not. So we in Malaysia coming back, we're not poor. We're a rich country plundered by our elites. We have enough money. I mean, look at our budget. Did you see much about mitigation on climate? I didn't read the whole thing because, you know, it's too kind of silly to even read it, but there's not much stuff there. And then there's some allocation to, you know, people wanting to do sustainable SMEs and something to do with nature protection. We don't even have the institutions to enable people to define what the criteria is, how to distribute the money. And if one is really cynical, you know, that's another channel for giving money to my friends. And it usually starts with, let's look at the Bumiputra smallholders and the Bumiputra nature lovers to get the money first. This is racist-based nonsense, right? So we have to change the whole structure of thinking about how we're going to deal with Malaysia's existential threats in relation to climate and resource management. Institutions first.
Well, even as we speak, Chandran, my neighborhood is going through another water disruption,
I know, five this year.
Which seems incredulous because water falls from the sky almost every day at this time of year. So in order to get constructive and instructional about the Malaysia situation, we are well aware in this country of the impediments to progress, shall we say, right? Which you've outlined in great detail in the last half an hour. What can we do? What is the Malaysia solution in terms of just being able to take control and be a little bit proactive, if not on an individual level, at a corporate level?
Well, you know, I'm aware that, you know, there's a tendency to think of what I've outlined as being negative. But I say this all around the world. If you don't confront the realities, then you seek appeasement and seduction in sort of Mickey Mouse ideas, right? But I understand people want solutions. But to start, I would go back to what I said. If you don't change the institutional frameworks in Malaysia, nothing can change because it's corrupt. Now, then can the corporations do something? And as I've argued, I think the corporations in Malaysia are complicit in this because of the race-based, non-meritocracy-based system we have, right? From the GLCs right through. Are there great Malaysian companies? Yes, there are. But they are all essentially also stuck in not being able to speak out. And I know many who, but we need leadership. So the first point to your question, there's no substitute for leadership. Sorry, there's no, you know, technological fix. There's no finance fix. You can have a lot of money, bad leadership, you have one NDV, right? So you need, but can companies do something? If there is leadership, there are many things they could do. For instance, you know, first things first, look at all your operations, all the companies listed on the brochure, and ask yourself 3 questions. The first one, have you followed every environmental law in the company? Have you followed everyone? This is simple stuff. I'm not even talking about sustainability because sustainability and environment are 2 different things. I'm happy to explain it. Have we followed it and put a report out? You don't need to do this ESG kind of smokescreen nonsense, right? You can do something very simple and you don't need to get one of the big 4 who is basically cover up your nonsense. That's what they get paid for, big fees. And you don't need one of the McKinsey guys. You can get some Malaysians to do this as long as you allow them access to all your data, right? That first one. Second one, have we essentially upheld all our fiduciary responsibilities in terms of our obligations in terms of our license to operate, including our governance structure, right? Have we done that? That includes, of course, also things like, you know, do we have a proper racial mixture in the boards, all of that? And we'll find out that most don't. The third thing then is, do we employ and meet all the labor laws? And the fourth element to that is, if we have done all of that, to your point, where do we go next, given the challenge we face, right? Where do we go next? What do we improve? So for instance, if you're a palm oil company, are you certain that every bit of your operations throughout the country essentially have not been involved in open burning, wastewater treatment, which can be zero discharge? So I come from a bioscience engineering background, zero discharge, right? Are you certain? Third, do you employ any illegal labor, and do you underpay your labor, and what's your land management like? What is your biodiversity record? So all of us can do these things, right? So that's where I think it starts, but it requires leadership at the corporate level. It requires boards that hold, CEOs responsible. I've seen very few of these. So that's where, and I can go on about floods, food supply issues. What are we doing about rising seas, biodiversity? That's a public policy areas, and also looking at the urban heating effects, right? So there's so many things companies can do, but you start by asking yourself those 3 questions. And, if you can't answer those things in 3 weeks, you got a big problem. So and then put it out in the public domain. Tell us what you do. But don't employ the big guys, because they'll cut and slice and dice it. And before you know it, it's an ESG report. And then it's just mumbo jumbo.
Well, in response to the questions you asked, Chandran, I think we kind of, by and large, know the answer to those questions, because we don't have the enforcement, nor do we have the institutional enforcement of those policies. So what happens next?
So
we know that,
but to your point, can companies do something? It doesn't matter if there's no enforcement. Am I going to do something only because I'm afraid the policeman will catch me? No, I do it because that is the law. But beyond the law, I am a responsible leader. That is a fundamental shift that we have to take. And I'm not even asking, suggesting we go into the other realm of sustainability, which requires fundamental shifts in business models, right? And that's some of the work we're doing with various companies around the world. In Malaysia, forget the enforcement. Forget why do you need enforcement to follow the law? The law is essentially enforced to make sure that enough people, and there are always enough people who will break it deliberately, are caught and set as examples. But if you're a CEO of a GLC, a listed company, my God, do you need enforcement?
Well, exactly. That's the point. Last question before we close for the morning, Chandran. Is there a business model to be, or can business models evolve to coalesce with basically environmental destruction, so that at least corporations can respond accordingly with their profit motive in mind? To obviously close the discussion on a positive note, maybe.
Yeah, I'm very positive. I'm very positive about calling out the truth, and then saying to people, "Okay, stand up and lead." Okay, everything else is hocus pocus. So to your point, are there examples? There are examples, but it does require fundamental business changes. So for instance, let me give you one example. There's a company that's involved in large scale production of fast food that's involves chickens. A couple of guesses, okay. So most of that chicken, as is chlorinated, chemicalized, etc. But some people like them, whatever turns you on. But that's a business model. But you don't have a right to a business. So this is the profit. This is the thing. Keep their profits going. No, my friends. You don't have a right to a profit if the externalities of that is social costs that is too high. Then who decides if that social cost is too high? Only the state. Right. So this is why, to my point about rules. But if the state is weak, then businesses need to do something. And if you're committed to this agenda, then you have to take action. So in terms of industrial chicken, just looking at our country, Malaysia, you could do a lot by essentially creating employment, using denuded land, reactivating agricultural land, by producing a network of thousands of farmers who produce essentially natural fed compound-based chickens according to very good standards, and then you create a supply chain. But about 50 years ago, the great Americans invented industrial meat, and then we had KFC, right? So that's what it's called. So if you still like KFC, well, let's make it people-based, community-based. You can create an incredible system of essentially empowering rural people to grow chickens in sustainable ways, et cetera, that produce that. So there are many examples, but you need competence. So in companies, I feel there's a CSR department, which has got nothing to do with anything real apart from, sort of hocus pocus. But then there's a sustainability thing that no one listens to. So you have to build science-based technical competence in companies. But fundamentally, you need your leaders to say, I want to do this. I'm taking us from industrial chickens to a different form. I'm reducing the carbon footprint. I'm going to protect biodiversity, and the feed material will come from local sources, and we will grow it in this way, and we will employ, hundreds of thousands of people, completely reframing all of that. And then you need the governments to essentially be partners in incentivizing those kinds of things, not with money, but with essentially, instruments of the market that enable people to do those things.
Chandran, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our discussion. We could have gone on for hours and hours, much more. You're always
Can I
cogent.
get questions from the audience? No, just say.
As it stands, I think you've answered every question. But do we have any? So, obviously, in the absence of those, always cogent, Chandran, always instructive, and of course, always good value. Thank you for your time. And I'm going to pass the floor back to Datin Sri.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandran. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I've been making notes throughout the time. And thank you so much, Chuang, for offering to moderate this. Really appreciate your inputs. So just to recap, this has been an incredible 2-hour session. I think I speak for all of us to say so much has been, shared, and my levels of understanding has increased exponentially. So just to recap, Dr. Salzman ran through the ecosystem services, the concept, gave us some examples, ran through the history of negotiated agreements globally and how we apply this to nature-based solution, essentially how to make trees worth more standing than cut down, and the examples around the world as well. I touched on Article 6. And then Meena Raman, of course, passionate as always. And, we wish her all the best in Glasgow, and she's there right now. And she stressed on the need for solutions, financing solutions, technology transfer, that we need to focus on rapid decarbonization and a different model for development, which is a low carbon pathway. And of course, Chandran very, very intelligently walked us through the real challenges that we are seeing. What is the narrative that we are hearing? Do we really need funding to act effectively? What do humans have the basic right to do? Can they consume everything that they want, even if it is destructive to the environment? What are the institutional frameworks that we need in place to support impactful climate action? And what is the leadership that's required at the corporate level beyond compliance? What is the responsibility of a corporate leader? So thank you so much to everyone for participating in this. Really appreciate your inputs, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.